Hey there, it's Melissa Brunetti, and welcome to the Mind Your Own Karma podcast.
Hey there, Karma Crew. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Mind Your Own Karma, the Adoption Chronicles. Today I have Tim Perdion on the show. He was born Thomas Griffin Demchak on March 1st, 1969, placed in the care of an adoption agency shortly after birth. He was adopted by his loving parents on April 28th, 1969. Despite growing up in a seemingly perfect adoptive family, Tim wrestled with deep-seated feelings of anger, depression, and anxiety. A struggle that persisted into adulthood. The discovery of his biological roots at the age of 46 rocked his world, unveiling the complex dynamics and secrets that had shaped his life. Today, Tim walks with his head held high, continuing his journey out of fear, obligation, and guilt. Tim has been transitioning from a life in the corporate world to serve as a life coach, speaker, and consultant. Tim's mission is to step into God's purpose for his life, using his experiences and insights to heal the pain of relinquishment, foster authentic connections, and empower others to live their truth. He is dedicated to sharing his story and the lessons he's learned to inspire and support adoptees and those dealing with trauma. Here is my interview with Tim Perdion. So we are welcoming Tim to the show today. Hi, Tim.
Hi, Melissa. How are you?
I'm great. I just want to thank you for coming on the show. I don't get a lot of males, coming on and volunteering. So I think it's very validating for the guys to hear another male perspective. So thanks for coming on today.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's just start at the beginning. Tell us what you know about the circumstances of your adoption.
Yeah. So I was born in 1969, and my adoptive family, they had adopted my sister about 18 months prior to me. So I was joining a family that had already adopted. And my mom wasn't able to have children. She had endometriosis and just couldn't have children. So adoption was the way for them to kind of build out their family. So I was adopted, and I was about 8 weeks old when I came home. Um, and the family that I was raised by was Catholic. So I was raised in a Catholic home. And I do know the circumstances around my birth and why I was put up for adoption. So, in 2015, I started to piece together some of the details of kind of what happened there when I met both of my biological parents. So my biological mother was in college, 21, and biological father was in law school also. And so I wasn't in the plans for them in terms of raising a child. And so I know it was a tough decision. I don't know all the circumstances of their relationship. I know that giving me up for adoption was basically the end of that relationship. So I've pieced together, that it was two kids who were Catholic, also raised Catholic, and weren't supposed to be doing what they did, and therefore the decision was to put me up for adoption. And so I was like a solution to a family that wanted to adopt because they couldn't have children as well, and that's a fairly common thing, certainly back at that point in time.
Yeah, definitely. So looking back, growing up, can you share your earliest memories of realizing that you were adopted and how that shaped your understanding and your identity?
Well, I always knew. I hear often guests say, well, I was told there was these books about explaining adoption, and I think that was my story too. So I never didn't know. But I also never felt like I belonged, right? I always had this notion that I was different. And I can remember, like, in school, you answer the question of like, what about your family origin? And often it starts, well, I'm adopted, so I don't really know.
Yep.
And that just never felt good because inherently I felt like, well, I'm just different because I'm adopted and everybody else knows something about their life, but I don't. And that always felt like I didn't really want to stick out in that way.
Yeah.
So that felt challenging for me. And I think it layered on different types of ways of just feeling different. And, I just remember getting angry a lot, maybe getting into little scraps, fights, and sometimes, I mean, I remember in the second grade, one kid said, "Hey, your eyes are brown, so you're full of, you know what?"
Mm.
And I punched him. And I remember going down to the principal's office, and I think what that was symbolic of was always seemed to be defending my identity or
Mm.
my right to be here. So there is this inherent undercurrent of you've got to prove your worth in this world. So, from the beginning, I felt like, my identity was in question and whether or not I was supposed to be here. So I just grew up feeling different. And I felt really different in the family because I was really competitive. So I was into sports. Nobody in my family was competitive. They were maybe anti-competitive, right? And so I always had these questions of like, where did this come from? Right. And I know where it came from because both of my biological parents ended up, they were lawyers and they had very competitive drives to achieve or to do things in life. And I think there was a lot of athleticism in those roots as well.
Yeah.
So I didn't know it back then, but I was just almost to a fault hyper competitive. I remember one time maybe in a grade school context, I was at a basketball camp and they get these notes about how you did and all that. And the notes on me at the end of the camp were like, not everybody's as competitive as you. You need to kind of consider that others, and be more of a teammate versus being really hard on other people. And I think I might have had this notion of like, isn't everybody as competitive? Isn't everybody wanting to achieve up to the standard? But, I think it's contextual. Like at a place and time, that's good, but all the time, it's not good.
Yeah. Tone it back a little bit.
Exactly.
Dial it down some.
Yeah.
So did your adoptive parents, did you feel like they had expectations? And how did that influence your
Mm,
sense of self if they did?
yeah. So my mother in particular, she didn't go to college. My dad didn't go to college. My mom was really smart in her class. She probably should have, but didn't have the opportunity to go. So what I remember is like really her being like a hard driving, high expectations for achievement, high expectations for grades. I remember like in the summers having to do like math facts in this back room of our house where, I was like, okay, you can go out and play after you do all this, multiplication tables and stuff like that. And I just remember like the focus was like always like making sure that we were, doing well in school and almost to a fault, I would say, maybe where it was like, I don't know, my other friends aren't doing this stuff.
Mm.
And so it just felt like, again, anytime there was like something that how I was being treated was different than others, it just layers on top of that, like, I must be different. So, like, maybe there's something wrong with me that this is why this is how you're treating me. And those aren't
Yeah.
necessarily conscious thoughts. That's like just that subconscious that I think, having, coming into the world with that primal wound that's invisible, and then having other types of things layered on top of that really reinforces that lie.
Yeah, definitely. So I know that addiction and mental health have been significant parts of your
Yeah.
journey, as so many other adoptees in those same
Yeah.
areas. Can you describe the moments when you felt most lost and how you found the
Mm.
strength to keep going?
Mm. So many times. I'd say to get to that, like what I saw in the sixth grade, I often looked to male authority figures for things that maybe I didn't get with my father. And so I had a sixth grade teacher who was like coach of a lot of sports, young new teacher, and I was like enamored with him. And so I was kind of like the teacher's pet. And then there was an incident where me and two other boys, we got in trouble, and somehow we had to be separated in different classrooms. And after that, he didn't talk to me. And I never felt like I was heard in terms of my side of the story. So fast forward, and he's a coach in, the school system. And several years later, 3 years later, I'm like playing basketball in an open gym, and I fall awkwardly as I'm kind of going to the basket, and I trip, and it's kind of a mess. And somebody's like, "Oh, hey, Messy Marvin," right? If you remember that from the chocolate milk commercials way back, and that's like this disheveled kid and all that.
Yeah.
And this teacher started calling me that too.
Wow.
And so I'm like, and I would say that, like, so there's this bullying, and then the teacher joins in. And I think there was something in me at that point in time that kind of broke, because I really stopped organized sports in the ninth grade.
Wow.
And I found a different path. And, whether it was, smoking pot or drinking. And when I found those things, it just, it was a way to escape.
Yeah.
And it was a way to numb. It was a way not to feel. And, I didn't know what that was. I didn't know this at the time, that there's like this big gaping hole inside that you're trying to fill. But I just knew that this stuff, and it just never felt safe to be myself. And, I might go home and try to get some support for different things that were going on that were confusing. And I don't feel like I got that. I felt like, mostly I got talked out of my feelings, right? You shouldn't feel that way, or, oh, don't, you know just diminishing or dismissing the feeling. So I think, like a lot of people, I just stuffed everything in. Well, that's like, it doesn't go away, it just goes in, and when it comes out, it's like you got this ammunition that just keeps going into the gun, and then you got this gun and it starts spraying bullets all over the place. And that was really what so in high school, trying to get through that, going to college, and then getting out of college, just like numbing and escaping, and just not having the self-awareness of what's really going on inside to figure that out. And
Just coping.
coping. And relationships, not uncommon. Relationships were always a struggle, wanting them, but then not really knowing how to sustain them, or being too needy in them, and just having no ability to kind of uh, show up in relationships in a secure way. When I did meet my biological mother, one of the things that she said was that she had attachment issues. I said, "Oh, well, me too."
Yeah.
So I really struggled, and I think I got very good at compartmentalizing, and I got good at compartmentalizing. Another predominant theme is secrets. So in the house I grew up in, there were secrets. And the most prevalent secret that I would say was most obvious to me was that my father had a twin brother who was gay, homosexual, and he had a life partner who was my godfather. So from the time I was born, they were together, and that's all I knew was my uncle and his partner. We called him Uncle, and we never talked about it. We never talked about the fact that they were of that lifestyle. They died in 1986 and 1990 of AIDS, and we didn't talk about that. They died of cancer. So, but I always knew, right? So we have this spidey sense, I think. I know that's like you always are more plugged into what's going on than, it's like the
Yes.
unspoken words, and it's the just that intuition. And so it was hard to understand why we're not talking about the thing that's obvious. And that again goes to that I must not matter, right? It must not be important enough for you to be truthful with me. So, and I don't know that that's the case, but that's the story that I would have told myself. So I ended up learning how to live a life of compartmentalization and of secrets. So because what I learned was image and preservation of image and showing the
Hmm.
world what we want, right? We've got two kids and, they're dressed this way, the family picture looks this way. And, so it was more important to project an image of everything's okay. And all the dysfunction was just swept under the carpet, which creates a lumpy carpet,
Yes.
right? So, but this is how I learned how to live. And I'm like, I think this is just how it's going to be. And, I got married at 25, had a son when I was, 30, and was divorced when I was 33. And I'm still struggling with just how to live life in kind of, let's say, truthful in a like transparent way. I'm struggling with life. I have a decent job. I'm good at that, but I'm struggling with everything outside of work. And so then I start moving. So I moved from Ohio to Chicago to Denver to San Antonio, and that's ended up getting divorced after a stretch of being gone for like 8 years. And I moved back and repeated the cycle. I got into another relationship. I had two daughters and just kept still struggling with living life without all the coping mechanisms. And, whether it was food or drinking or drugs or working too much or competing or whatever it was like playing whack-a-mole with all these different types of coping mechanisms.
Yeah.
And the culmination of it was when I was, 5 years ago in 2019, I had a couple explosions of anger. So the anger that had been stuffed down started coming out. And I'm like, okay, I need help. And it was starting to, the anger, I could see how it was hurting other people. And maybe it was hurting other people from a long time ago, but I started to see it in a way that was in my face to the point where I had to do something. And so I left work for 30 days. I went to a place called Sierra Tucson in Arizona, residential residential treatment for trauma and mental health and addiction. And it's like going to adult school. Now, the interesting thing is that when I went there, I started to dig into all my understanding of trauma. However, we didn't talk about my adoption much. It didn't really come up. I didn't, and when I left after 60 days, I understood about codependency. I understood about mind body connection and what we eat has an impact on our mental health. I understood about the addiction cycle. I understood about like all kinds of things, the window of tolerance and just self-regulation and mindfulness and all these things. I had a therapist that I worked with on body dysmorphia and disordered eating because my weight had been up and down, up and down, up and down. And so it wasn't until 2020 that I read The Primal Wound.
Mm.
And then I'm like, holy cow, this is like, where's this been? Right.
Yeah.
And
So
so
was it totally validating for you to read that?
I would say it was the most prescriptive thing that I have ever read. And there's a lot of stuff in there and a lot of stuff would resonate. And some people like,
Hmm.
I don't really get that. Down to like this story in there where, sometimes because they feel like they were stolen, adoptees might act out in ways in where they steal stuff. And when I was in maybe ninth grade, I was at a old box, department store or like a store, and I stole a cassette tape. I had the money. My parents are with me, but so I'm like, yeah, I've done that. For no reason. And
Mm.
I'm like, and so these really interesting things that we will do to act out like in kind of crazy ways. And then I started to really realize any trauma I experienced in my life after birth was layered on top of all that.
Yeah.
So I really started to feel like, okay, this is now where it's the coming out of the fog, I guess,
Hmm.
because, I just thought I believed the lies. I thought there was something wrong with me. My behavior was bad. I did a lot of things that I wasn't proud of. And I just thought like I didn't really fully connect to the adoption, or maybe I didn't want to go there. I know that like with my adopted family, it was not a topic they wanted to talk about a lot. I think it made my mom uncomfortable any talk. And
Hmm.
honestly, I never had much interest. I displayed not much interest in knowing because I felt like if I displayed that, she would be upset. But when the opportunity came in 2015 in Ohio, when they changed the laws, my sister, who lives in California, told me, "Hey, do you know they changed the laws?" I didn't know, but was going to happen in a week. So
Wow.
I wrote a letter to the state and I got back my original birth certificate.
It was that easy.
It was that easy.
Wow. That's amazing. So you had a second divorce in 2021 that kind of marked
Yeah.
another turning point for you. How did that experience influence your spiritual journey and lead you
Yeah.
to Christianity?
Yeah. So I mentioned before I was raised Catholic. And for me, going into a Catholic church growing up, I always felt like, again, it was more reinforcement of the shame that I was carrying. I would go to confession, but I never saw my parents go to confession.
Mm.
I felt judgment. I didn't know the story of the Bible. I didn't know who Jesus was. I didn't know that. We didn't ever read the Bible. So it felt like rules. It felt like, shame. It felt like kind of, again, reinforcement of that I don't matter or I'm not a good person.
Mm.
So I think from the time I was 18 to 20, whatever, I just didn't go to church. And when I went to the trauma and rehab place, higher power was introduced, and I think initially I got into kind of that more new age spirituality and the universe and all of that. And so there was a hurdle of church hurt, I think, that I had to overcome. And when I understood the difference between institutional religion, which is like government, and
Yeah.
then actually just a church that says, hey, if you're a dysfunctional person like us, we're here every week. And all we want to do is try to make Jesus make sense. And the first series in 2021 that I went to in this church was about toxic relationships. And they're talking about toxic relationships, which I'm like, this is exactly what I learned. Well, it's what I lived out, but this is what I learned and now you're cross-referencing that with the Bible, and there's things that make sense. And one of the
Mm.
things that they said was, if you want freedom, the only way to get freedom is total surrender. And I would just say that I never surrendered, right? I never surrendered all of my coping mechanisms. I might have surrendered 7 out of 10, but I would keep these over here. So I could put down the drinking, I could put down certain things, and then, but it would be the food or it would be, other things. And so I started to realize all the similarities to the stories in the Bible. And so when I read the Bible and I started to understand the stories of those characters in the Bible, Jesus came after the orphans and the widows and those less fortunate. He didn't come after the privileged. And so there were stories of Joseph and Moses and Moses was adopted. And there were stories of Joseph who had just trials and tribulations. And I heard things that made me feel better about my life. And to the point where I was like, okay, this is like, I feel like I belong to something.
Mm.
And I started to learn also about like, and I've read so many books and just been in search of so much understanding. But this book I read was called Spiritual Slavery to Spiritual Sonship. And the orphaned heart is one that has fears of abandonment, fears of rejection, fears of intimacy, and don't trust people. Well, that's a very common set of variables for any of those of us that entered the world the way we did through adoption.
Yeah.
And what the author describes is that the path to sonship, knowing what it means to be a son of the Creator, is forgiveness. And so, forgiveness of self, forgiveness of others, and all of what I think has happened over the last 3 years has been this softening of a hardened heart. This was a heart condition for me where it was just a big wall around my heart and feeling like I got to defend myself, I've got to protect myself against, others. And so it's just been this like onion type of deal where it's just, looking at forgiveness, looking at anger and letting it go, looking at, the sources of, bitterness, and just realizing that um, there's a community of people, whether it's the church community or this adoptee community. And the adoptee community to me is interesting because, and I've gotten into maybe some debates with people in the adoptee community about like, well, the religious institution was responsible for my adoption. So I have a hard time with religion. And I understand that mine was too. But I also know that those are organizations and institutions that are almost like government, and they're created by sinners, humans. So they're not perfect. And if you look at what is the story that's in the Bible actually say, it's often misrepresented, I think, in bigger religious institution types of things. So part of what I had to really do is surrender my old thinking and become open. And in this one other book I read, it's called Soul Care. It talks about adoption implies belonging and freedom. If you talk to any adoptee, we want to belong and we want freedom from the burden of what we feel inside. And he also says, what you don't know won't hurt you. We hear that, but he says, when it comes to the soul, that's a dangerous thing. It's a dangerous lie. So self-awareness is the gateway to life change, and it doesn't guarantee it, but you can't get there without it. So my self-awareness has gone up tremendously in terms of like my willingness to look at every aspect of the condition within me to allow myself to really identify those core lies. Now, the core lies for me growing up were I got to perform, I got to achieve, or I got to please others, or I won't be loved. Right. So it always felt like love was conditional. And so at the end of the day, it's been a gift to have this ability of becoming more self-aware. And I would say that it started with the upheaval of what was going on inside. So this internal disturbance that was producing external consequences that I had to address.
Yeah.
So it's not a straight line for sure.
No,
Yeah.
it's not. So it kind of leads me to that phrase that you said, your pain has a purpose.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you personally, and how has that belief guided you?
Well, I think, yes, I was adopted, but I also look at men in general, and there's a lot of men who struggle in silence, struggle with. I hear a lot of people say, well, nothing I ever do is good enough. Well, so that comes from some kind of lie or some kind of upbringing. And so ultimately what the purpose is how do I tell my story? How do I get into circles of other men that create safe spaces so other men who are experiencing burdens, hurts in silence can become more willing to, in community, kind of heal together. So I think you mentioned not a lot of males on the show, and I've heard some really good ones. But yeah, there's a disproportionate share of women to men. And I think that that's like something that I'd say God's put on my heart is to tell the story, because I know what it looks like to live a life of wearing masks to try to make it seem like everything's okay, and then to be struggling
Yeah.
in silence. And so I think that's really, and we had another series about breaking the cycles. And it was the kind of thing on that one was you could stay stuck in the why of your circumstances, and that be in that victimhood and just anger and just thinking that the world's against me, which is very easy to do if you've been adopted. Or you could turn that pain into a purpose. And God doesn't waste a hurt. There's so many different characters in the scripture that have had so many different types of trials and tribulations, but as they remain faithful, God blessed them. And so, I think it's how do I redeem all of my experiences so that it can be valuable to other people, to help people realize that, we're not alone, you're not alone. And what I think of what the obstacles are, it's we don't necessarily know how to deal with our feelings. The stuff comes up, and anger is one of those things that a lot of men will struggle with. And we probably had homes that, either we saw a father who expressed that anger, or when anger came up, we just kind of pushed it down and we dismissed it. So we don't really know what it's telling us. And I said on another show recently that anger is a teacher. Well, it's a teacher to help us go within. It's a secondary emotion. And if we can understand what it's trying to teach us, we now have a chance of recognizing, well, it's sadness or it's whatever that's behind it, which is okay. Like that's the other thing is in order to heal, we have to feel these things. And, I had a therapist that used to try to get me to cry and couldn't do it. And in the last year, probably back in the September timeframe, I started to, what I would say is I fully surrendered a lot of things. And there was a lot of tough stuff going on in my life professionally that led me to just kind of put my head down at work one day, and it came out. All of the stuff came out. And so what I know, it's like those cries that you are afraid to start because you don't know if they'll ever stop.
Yeah.
Stressed? Anxious? Discover the healing power of somatic mindful guided imagery. Reconnect with your mind, body, and spirit, and unlock your true potential. Feel calm, confident, and in control. Visit somatichealingjourneys.com to start your journey towards a healthier, happier you.
And I think that was the biggest fear I had is like, I don't know how to control what's in there. And if it starts coming out, it might never stop. And it took a while for it to stop. But what I realized is that that's like healing, letting that out, honoring those feelings, recognizing, and so just letting that out. And now that's a process. And I've gone to a couple men's retreats, and it's all around reclaiming the male masculine heart, because every heart has been wounded in some kind of way. And if our earthly father wasn't representative of the creator, we've got some kind of hurts. And so therefore we wear masks, we show up in ways we think we have to achieve in order to, all those things that, our identity can be built on, but we feel empty inside. So being in community with other men and helping others identify the stuff that's going on below the surface. Again, the metaphor I love the most is that iceberg. where you can see about 10% above the
Yeah.
water line and all the stuff that's below the water line. Well, that's, and that's there for a lot of people. And if we're able to be vulnerable about what's below our water line, that's where the healing is. And that's where, in a safe space, that's what's available. So I really feel like that's like the way I'm being directed, is to kind of help other people, to really become more aware of what's below the waterline.
Yeah. So important. Let's talk about your biological roots for a second. At age
Yeah.
46, you had some discoveries. Why don't you talk
Yeah.
about that?
So, within 2 weeks of sending something to the state of Ohio, I get a letter back, and in the letter is an original birth certificate and also a letter that my mother had written in 1993 that says if I would have contacted the state of Ohio, she would have she was authorizing the release of her contact information. Which today you might get a notification, hey, there's something in your file, but in 1993 that didn't work like that, and I
Right.
didn't ever have any kind of sense that it was possible. So anyway, I got the birth certificate and I enter the name into Google, and all this information shows up. So she was a civil rights attorney, managing partner of a civil rights attorney, a firm in the Bay Area, and there were significant cases from the 70s and 80s that her firm and she was involved in, big discrimination cases and stuff like that. So there was a whole bunch of information, including an article written by the online version of the Houston Chronicle that had basically a feature on her and the condo that she lives in. And there's like 25 pictures of her condo. So I immediately had pictures of her, and so I immediately had like this rush of information,
Yeah.
and it was overwhelming. This was all before I ever read The Primal Wound. So I know you talked to a lot of guests, like I was not prepared for this. And I didn't know I wasn't prepared. So I'm like going with this. And I kind of pieced together, like, she lives in, Houston. And I found her sister lives in Houston also. And I somehow found her sister's email address.
Hmm.
So I sent a letter to my biological mother, but I sent an email to her sister to say, hey, I know you're probably close to your sister. She may be getting this letter. Let her know, soften the blow a little bit.
Yeah.
And so, so she gets the letter, and within a month, she happened to be coming to Northeast Ohio because she was on the advisory board of the the law school here. And so we met, like, in between, April 2015 and May when we met, a lot of emails back and forth. And I sent some pictures, gave profile, and I would say at the time what I was trying to do is I was trying to show my worth, like that I achieved something, that I had, good job, I had a family. I was trying to put on my best behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And we met. First meeting in person was like 2 hours in a hotel lobby, just talking. And I would say it was strange to be in front of somebody who your communication style is similar,
Yeah.
features like that mirroring for the first time. And this started like this, I'll call it the honeymoon period. A week later, her sister and brother came in. We met because her mom was turning 90. So I met more family members a week later. And then fast forward a month or so, she came back and met my family. She met my parents. And we had this, and she met my wife at the time and my three children. And so we had this, like, and she wrote letters to my kids that were like, not all these families kind of get together this way, but this is amazing, and just all really positive things. And So after that meeting in July, we saw pictures. She, spent a lot of time, and it was like after that, we communicated and didn't see each other again, but we communicated a bunch. Probably 2 Christmases where I received, some Christmas cookies in the mail. And then I'd say fast forward to 2018, it was Mother's Day, and I'm like, the communication really kind of dropped off. And I was like, that was a lot for us. I'm wondering if you're open to kind of, reconnecting and, you know, um, and it probably was like 3 weeks later, I got an email that basically said, yes, it was a lot. I'm glad that we met. Looks like you had a nice family, you have a good family, and had a nice, that. But I've had to do some professional work and on myself, and I think it'd be better if we don't communicate.
Wow.
So, I Google kind of the fact pattern of that, and it's, that secondary kind of rejection. And I think I had read the book by then, and so I was kind of aware of, no, I hadn't read the book yet, but at any rate, so I'm like processing that. And at this time, my life isn't, like going tremendously well. I've got so many other upheavals going on. And so I kind of just put that aside for a while and just sat on it. And independent of the meeting with her, I had, when I first met her, she said, she goes, I haven't talked to your father in about 40 years. But I know that he's also an attorney, and he's in the area. And she said, and there's a strong resemblance.
Wow.
So I took the name that was on the birth certificate and I just put the first and middle name, and I put, those names into Google with attorneys in Cleveland, and up pops his information.
Mm.
And so before she could tell me who it was, I knew. And then she's like, yep, that's him. And so she wrote him a letter saying, hey, I've met our son and all that. And then it took him a year. So in 2016, he hadn't responded to me. He responded to her, but he didn't respond to me. So in 2016, he wrote me a letter and we met, and that started the process of us establishing a relationship. And so we've met since 2016. We've probably met 10 or so times for lunch and all that. So I've been putting together more information about the nature of their relationship, and again, like I mentioned, I think giving me up for adoption was the end of the relationship. 5 years later, he ended up getting married, and he has 2 sons. He still hasn't told them that they have a brother.
Oh, wow.
So that's like where I'm at now with that. The interesting thing is that I went to high school with a couple people that know one of the son's wives. I probably know 5 or 6 people that could call and introduce me. When I went to rehab, I met somebody that knew one of the son's wife. So, it's interesting. My daughter plays basketball. She played against 2 that would be her cousins this past season, but they don't know. Just so the theme of secrets is prevalent throughout the story. And I think that, if you grew up in the 60s with strong Catholic upbringing and, you get, someone gets pregnant outside of a marriage, if it's possible to kind of give that person up for adoption and like kind of get this so that it just goes away, then that was, I think, maybe the intention. But everything comes out, right? So now that, the truth comes out, everybody's got to process that in their own way. And so that's a challenging one. because
talk about that obligation that we feel a
yeah,
lot of times to keep secrets for those that have made decisions for us when we couldn't make decisions for ourselves.
yeah, you know, it's one I struggle with because there's like this sense of like if I've turned over my power, not even willingly, but if somehow I didn't have the power to make decisions, um, it doesn't always feel right to take back the power that I do have. And I think part of my process to come on your show and to really jump into this community is to say, how do I work through that so that like I take back my power and telling stories and become and when I listen to all of the podcasts, it's like medicine, listening to other adoptees tell their story.
Yeah.
Just to hear my story through the words of somebody else, because, someone will say something like, yes, that's exactly kind of how I feel. And I feel like, I tell you, I listened to probably 15 to 20 of them over the last week. And every story's got those complications and all of that. I don't hear a lot of stories like mine where like there's this wall with not wanting to kind of unveil those secrets. So it's, I don't know. I think having a lot more faith and having kind of this notion that I'm not in control, that someone else, the creator's in control. I'm like, I could use my will at times, and I think I've lived my life often trying to exercise my will. And so, in some ways, I'm surrendering to God's will in this. And I think when it's time, it'll be time.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's an excuse, but that's kind of the way I feel about it, and the way it makes me feel better is like I don't know the circumstances. Here's the biggest challenge. If I was a secret back then, I just know there's other secrets. I don't know what they are. I just know that there's not an isolated secret in someone's life. When I went to the rehab, I also did a genogram. And the genogram is one of those like family trees, but you look at all the presence of addiction, secrets, abuse, and you can see the generational
Yeah.
patterns of all of that mental health challenges and all that. And that basically says that this is how these cycles just keep repeating. And so I know that all of the stuff that God wants to come out will come out in His time. So, one thing that I would say that's an evidence of that is that I got baptized last December, and through ancestry, I had met my biological mother's cousin, first cousin. And I got his contact information. And on January 1st of this year, I texted him. And within a couple hours, he calls me, and he happens to be a pastor. And so we meet a couple days later, and it was a really cool meeting. And he introduced me to her brother, a brother I had not met. And he's been a believer for 44 years. And so on Valentine's Day of this year, I met him. So I now have a relationship with my biological uncle. And if I would have met him in 2015, we probably wouldn't still have a relationship because of the things that happened in my life. So I think, in Nancy Verrier's book, it sometimes says it might not always be the biological parent that you end up forming a relationship with, but sometimes it can be a cousin or an uncle or an aunt or something like that. So, there's evidence that there's a higher power working in all the different parts of my story. And I'll tell you, that's a relationship that is just proved to be fruitful for me because we mirror each other. We, have a lot of common features, and I've learned a lot about my story. that I wouldn't have known otherwise by just understanding more of the bigger picture of the family history and all the different types of challenges that might be in that part of the family history. So, yeah, it's these are so complicated, and just because I want to have a relationship doesn't mean that everybody else does, and so it can be disruptive when these things that people thought would never really come out.
Yeah, true. So I just love that your journey is one of turning trauma into triumph. How do you see your story continuing to unfold from here?
Yeah, so I'm working through a process right now of becoming a life coach and taking kind of what I've learned and saying, how do I put that into some form of support for others, coaching, speaking, and so I think that like I've got this kind of purpose that I need to turn into something. And there's a lot of your guests that have found their purpose a long time. I didn't. I think I was living out someone else's blueprint, and so I think this has been kind of a late discovery purpose. And I think the purpose is to kind of help other people with like the things that I've gone through. So, um, you know, right now, I'm going through that process of trying to take all of what I've experienced in my life, come up with a framework to kind of help support other people through challenges. And I know that particularly men struggle, like we've said, struggle with dealing with these types of things. So to be supportive to that population is really something that I'm passionate about. I'm also working with a coaching program to get onto a TEDx stage. So there's not a lot of male adoptees telling stories on that stage. And you might have heard one. There's a Ruth, there's a really one of the more notable TEDx talks on adoption by a woman. And so I'm going to go down that path of figuring out like how to represent my story on that stage to give other people kind of this, when you don't feel like there's hope, there's always hope. There's nobody's alone. There's communities all over the place, but it really takes becoming vulnerable. And male vulnerability, you don't hear those words together too often. And so I think it was just a set of circumstances in my life that led me to where I'm at. And I would say that the thing that I know is that there's a purpose, because there are probably 10 times I could say, well, there must be a purpose because otherwise I wouldn't be here. Right. So I think, there's these signs along the way that you look back, you're like, okay, now I get the message. But you've said it, like until you get sick and tired of being sick and tired, we can loop through the same types of cycles, same types of patterns, same types of hurts, until we say, enough's enough.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things, because I was deep into Christianity for a lot of years, I think the thing that's kind of missing there, especially for adoptees, is there's always the talk of forgiveness, but then there's really no validation first. I think that's so important to have that validation first, to work through that and feel like you've been seen and heard before you can move through to releasing and forgiving.
Yeah, that's a complicated one because we could go through a lot. And so who do we need to be seen and heard from? Because I definitely agree, there's nothing more validating than, and that's why the adoptee community is so amazing, because I don't have to explain to you parts of my story. No, you really need to understand this. No, I don't have to do that. You get it. But when we try to explain our story to other people that aren't part of that, and I just think that adoptees get it. I don't think adoptive parents get it. My father read The Primal Wound, and he's like, I just don't understand how babies would know the difference. And so, how invalidating is a comment like that
Yeah.
by not really trying to understand? And I don't blame him necessarily, because I just think that it's too hard for some people to get.
Mm-hmm.
But the challenge is that we may never get that validation or being seen from people we want it from.
Yes.
But the ultimate creator, so to speak, would be the place to get that. Now, I know that like what I went through life and trying to chase and fill that hole with things on the outside was, I was looking in the wrong places. And so, you know, some people might say, well, that's the Jesus hole, right? And that's like what you need to do is kind of find something that is unconditional, because nothing on this side of earth is really unconditional, which is simply because we're all humans. It's a very complicated thing, and I I don't pretend to have all the answers, and it's everybody's situation's different, right? So
Yeah.
all the angles, all the hurts, all the different types of circumstances for everybody is different. That's why I love these communities of kind of adoptees who are willing to have the space for others to tell their stories without judgment.
Yeah.
That might not be for me, but I understand.
Mm-hmm. I think for me, helping me get through it, because I also had second rejection from my birth mother. And really, at first feeling that personally and taking that on, myself.
Yeah.
But I think what helped me release that and her was understanding that she's operating from her life experience and her
Yeah.
traumas as well.
Yeah.
And it's not about me.
Yeah.
It's all
Yeah.
about her and how she
Mm.
operates from where she's coming from in her life experience. And just understanding that helped me tremendously
Yeah.
be able to have some compassion.
Yeah.
Not necessarily, say that everything that she did was right and, it was okay, because it wasn't okay, but I was able to get to that point of releasing
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. Um, to understand the circumstances isn't necessarily to agree with them, but it's to understand. And I think what I've understood about my biological mother as well is that there were tough circumstances. The relationship with her father was tough. There would have been like, I don't think that anybody would have uh, uh, she would have been dismissed, or maybe wouldn't have been accepted if they would have known. And I know that she didn't tell anybody in her family for like 25 years,
Mm,
which just says like, how lonely would it be to be in a place where you don't have support? You're scared. You're not sure what to do. You're probably in this fractured relationship, so you're alone. And then you have the industry of adoption at that point basically saying, well, here's the option that you have available.
yeah.
And so many people probably made that decision thinking it was the best decision, but then looking back and saying, well, you can't take it back, but what if?
Yeah. And what would be the consequences of turning your back and having to deny your maternal instincts? What
Yeah.
effect does that have on birth mothers?
Well, I just know that she didn't get married. She didn't have any other children.
Mm,
And
yeah.
last August, I sent an email to her, trying to open the door again, and it was closed fairly. She didn't respond to me, but I understand through, my uncle that she felt like I was not taking no for an answer. And, part of what I know is that, like me, if you have this wall that protects your heart, it's easy to try to keep stuff out. And so I just know that if the event was traumatic, I would rather keep that out of my peripheral vision, so to speak, so that the memories associated with it don't, because that's overwhelming. So I can understand that. Doesn't make it hurt any less. But I guess what I have is I have compassion, and I have a tenderness that says, I see that experience as being very painful. And that's unfortunate, but part of it is like I'm not in control. There's a divine presence that's kind of guiding all of us, and all you can do is pray for somebody to hope that like they will experience healing on their time as well.
Exactly. Yeah. Maybe someday she'll get sick and tired of feeling sick and tired.
Yeah.
You never know.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
So go ahead.
I'm just going to add this one thing. It's like, it's a John Maxwell quote. It's people change when they hurt enough that they have to learn that they what they want to, and then receive enough that they're able to. So there's a time for everybody, but we're all on different paths.
Yeah. So in closing, what would you like struggling adoptees to know?
And well, I would say that education and awareness, and if you haven't read The Primal Wound, or if you haven't read some of the other resources that are out there, I would definitely take advantage of those, because it starts with awareness. And when I got the awareness, I could then take ownership of what I was understanding. Without the awareness, I wouldn't have been able to take ownership, and I couldn't take action. So I think it starts with awareness, and then you can take ownership. And you have to take ownership of our part. The biggest challenge, I think, for adoptees is that we've been victimized in some manner. And so do we continue to take that story and become that and live that out, or do we take ownership and change the narrative? And so it's challenging those lies, those core lies that we believed about our worthiness and us being lovable, and challenging those and replacing them with the truth of what the Creator says we are. I would also say that the community is amazing. So if someone's adopted and they're not like getting into these communities that exist in the different social platforms, that's one of the best things they could do. You listen to 5 podcasts that adoptees tell their story, and you're going to hear your story being told by other people. And so those resources that are available are amazing. So those are the things. Get plugged into the space where you can be seen and understood by people who get it.
Yeah, that's huge. So where can we find you? You have a website and all the things that you're doing and upcoming things?
Yeah, I have a website, prodigalpathways.com. There's a way to get in touch with me on that. I'm in the process of really, putting some focus onto that. I'm on LinkedIn as well. And, so there are ways to get in touch with me if you have those links in the show notes.
I do.
I'm happy to connect with anyone, but in particular male adoptees, because I think there's some unique circumstances in those types of stories. So those are the types of people that I would definitely love to connect with.
Great. Yeah, we'll have all those links in the show notes. Thanks so much for coming on today, Tim.
Well, I really appreciate what you're doing, and it's been amazing to have this opportunity. So thank you.
And thank you, Karma Crew, for listening today. And as always, take what you need and leave what you don't. And always remember to mind your own karma.
This podcast is created for educational purposes by the telling of adoption experiences. The views expressed in this podcast may not be those of the host or Mind Your Own Karma.